When I learn of incidents such as the massacre of millions of men, women, and children perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II, how is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, who are courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? Now, there are some studies in my discipline, social psychology, that seem to provide a clue to this question. The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University.
So the purpose of the experiment done by Milgram was to study obedience, and he was particularly interested in why the Holocaust could have happened and why people had obeyed even on commands that were lethal and cruel to other people. And so, subjects?
He picked 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50, and they were from lots of different backgrounds and different occupations. They thought they were participating in a study about how punishment affects memory, not what they were actually doing.
Yeah, so it was kind of like a deceptive study in that way, because they thought that they were just seeing how punishment affected memory rather than actually thinking that they were in a study on obedience. And it was a double-blind experiment because the experimenter, the person telling the person to like shock the other people, was an actor as well as the person who was the learner. That's okay.
The shock generator had 30 different voltage levels marked, and it went from 15 to 450 volts. The first one was labeled slightest shock, and the last one, like, they were labeled danger, high voltage, and like marked like triple X, and so they knew that they would end up hurting the victim.
Yeah, so there wasn't any confusion on if they would hurt the victim or not, because it said like how painful it was underneath it. And the other thing that happened too was that it was a fake shock generator, which the subject didn't know at the time, but it actually wasn't delivering shocks, but they had an actor like actually screaming, and we have a clip of that, which we'll show you now.
Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is a word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you are instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts, and you increase the shock one step on each error.
That is incorrect. This one will be 195 volts.
The learner was hidden from the teacher by a partition.
Dance.
And like in the required reading, which everyone read, there's two sides to this on whether or not it's ethical. And the one that you read, which was the third reading, was Milgram talking about how he thought that the study wasn't necessarily unethical because they had no intention of the signs that they thought would happen. Like he even wrote later that the distress that all the subjects ended up showing was something that was never seen before in a psychology lab. And so he had it reviewed by a bunch of psychologists beforehand, and none of them said they could have predicted what would have happened. And they also said that it was kind of okay because the subjects technically could stop if they wanted to, because 35% of them didn't go all the way through. And another point that he made was that they only expected 1% to go all the way to the end, so they didn't think that it would actually cause like a super distressful situation. They thought that they would know that they could stop whenever they wanted to. And he said even if something bad did happen, at the end they had psychologists come in and talk to them to make sure that there weren't any lasting effects. And after the study was done a year later, he contacted all the participants again, and they all said that they were happy to have been in the study. And he had a psychologist hired, and he talked to them again, and they said that there weren't any lasting effects. And so he said that the benefits outweighed any like possible costs that could have happened. And so that was his argument for it being ethical. And then on the other side,
a lot of people argued that it was unethical because the way that they like deceived the people that were administering the shocks into thinking that they were actually hurting somebody, and how convincing that the actor like on the other side was doing like pounding on the walls and like begging for him to stop. And it was also unethical because like even like the guy, or if the guy like tried to stop and said like I can't do this, like the actor, the authority figure, was instructed to keep going and like get them to like not be able to quit and like enforce their authority, I guess. We chose the side like thinking that his experiment was unethical because during the experiment, a bunch of the test subjects that were like administering the shocks had some pretty serious reactions. A lot of them like were trembling, they were making like noises, there was nervous laughter, they were like digging their fingers into their skin. They were like 3 actually had seizures, and 1 was so violent that they had to stop, like he had to stop his experiment. And yeah.
So like the fact that people, even though technically they didn't expect these responses to come, it doesn't make the experiment ethical, because personally, if we were in the experiments that we have to do for our project and I had a seizure, I would be pretty upset. And so, and one of the other points that we wanted to point out is this wasn't really clear in Milgram's response, but he actually, the actor, the person who was the learner, the person being shocked, actually at one point stated that he had a heart condition, and he was like telling the person to stop shocking him, etc., which seemed kind of violent to us. And then whenever the the subject said they wanted to stop, the experimenter, another actor, the person telling him to administer the shock, would say things like, please continue, the experiment requires that you continue, it's absolutely essential that you continue, and he would finally say, you have no other choice, you must go on.
This man was one of those 65%.
This one will be 195 volts. The correct one.
Let me out of here.
Slow. Dance.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me
You're
out.
responsible for it. Red. That is incorrect. This will be at 3:30.
Ow!
The correct phrase is rich
Let me out of
boy.
here. Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out, I tell you. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me
The
here.
next phrase is
Let me
fast.
out. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Bird,
Let me
car,
out.
train, plane.
Eventually, the learner pretended to be unconscious.
Continue, teacher.
That is incorrect. This will be 3:45. The correct answer is fast, bird.
Like the actor was instructed to say it in like a very specific way, like to get a certain response from the person administering the shocks. Like it was very like specific the way they were supposed to go about that, and like how severe they like said each statement.
Mm-hmm. And the fact that he said you must go on, you have no other choice. While you're in this situation, it might seem like that's true, even though technically at the beginning you read a form that said that you could stop. You're under so much stress at that point, you might not be thinking clearly, which they should have taken into account. And so ultimately, the fact that this experiment isn't continuing and they have been done things like this now, other than online virtually, we believe that it's definitely unethical.
Definitely.